Breaking late this afternoon, brand new bombshell reporting from the Wall Street Journal that might explain why Donald Trump appears so anxious and, frankly, flat-footed when it comes to releasing documents related to Jeffrey Epstein. The Wall Street Journal citing senior administration officials in its reporting that when Justice Department officials reviewed what Attorney General Pam Bondi called a, quote, truckload of documents related to Epstein earlier this year, they discovered Donald Trump's name appeared multiple times. From that report, quote, in May, Bondi and her deputy informed the president at a meeting in the White House that his name was in the Epstein files, the official said. Many other high-profile figures were also named, Trump was told. Being mentioned in the records isn't a sign of wrongdoing. The officials said it was a routine briefing that covered a number of topics and that Trump's appearance in the documents wasn't the focus. Now, in response to this reporting in the Wall Street Journal, the White House has issued a statement to NBC News that reads, quote, the fact is that the president kicked him out of his club for being a creep. This is nothing more than a continuation of the fake news stories concocted by the Democrats and the liberal media, just like the Obama-Russiagate scandal, which President Trump was right about, end quote. That is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Chait, is here. Also joining us, MSNBC senior political analyst, my colleague Alex Wagner is here, and former top official of the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissmann is here. Because this story dropped, I want to do a little bit more of letting this sink in for any of our viewers who haven't had a chance to read through it all before I turn this over to all of you. This, importantly, from the Wall Street Journal, which I think days ago found itself on the receiving end of a lawsuit from Donald Trump because of its reporting on this elaborate birthday card and drawing. So important that it's the Journal again out ahead in this story with a new scoop. It reads, Bondi also told the president at this meeting that the Justice Department decided to not release more Jeffrey Epstein documents because of the presence of child pornography and the need to protect victims. Trump and Attorney General Bondi, when the Justice Department reviewed what Attorney General Pam Bondi called this truckload of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein, they discovered Trump's name appeared multiple times. As we reported in May, they informed the president of this. The officials said it was a routine briefing. This is interesting. Quote, they also told Trump that senior Justice Department officials did not plan to release any more documents related to the investigation of the convicted sex offender because the material contained child pornography and victims' personal information. Trump said at the meeting he would defer to the Justice Department's decision to not release any further files. Andrew Weissmann, just take us inside what this reporting is detailing and what it says to you.
Sure. So I think the main issue that people need to focus on is the schizophrenic approach of the Trump administration to this issue. On the one hand, they are saying we want to be as transparent as possible. And on the other hand, they're saying we're not releasing anything. So they, on the transparency part, they say we want to be transparent and we're going to go to court and we're going to ask judges to release grand jury transcripts. Now, they know that the law on that issue is dead set against them, so they can blame the courts when they say no. It's also in grand jury transcripts, the actual proceedings in the grand jury are the area where it's least likely that Donald Trump's name appears. By contrast, the part where they're not turning anything over is all of the voluminous investigative material, which the Wall Street Journal now is reporting, which is something that we sort of assumed had to be true, but now the reporting is it is true, which is that material has Donald Trump's name in it. And of course, shouldn't be surprising because there's so much reporting that the two of them knew each other and socialized with each other. It doesn't mean that Donald Trump committed a crime, but his reaction to this is the thing that's probably the most telling because it certainly is he protests too much. But that material, and this is sort of the take home, I think, for everyone and when I think about this, is that material, the voluminous investigative material that the Department of Justice has, that can be turned over right now, today, this minute. There is no grand jury requirement that you go to court to turn that over. So here, if the Department of Justice and the Trump administration is saying, oh, we want to be transparent, that is information that they don't need to go to the court and turn over. We just saw them do that in the Martin Luther King Jr. files, turning that over. So you really are seeing this continuation of a schizophrenic approach, and the Wall Street Journal reporting gives you certainly a motive for why they are sort of, on the one hand, saying we're going to go to court, and the other hand saying the stuff that's most likely to name Donald Trump, we are not disclosing.
I mean, Alex, we also get a little bit of the timeline filled in. Let me read a little bit more from this new reporting in the Journal. This meeting, they write about, set the stage for the high-profile review to come to an end. Pam Bondi had said in February that Epstein's client list was, quote, sitting on my desk right now to review, end quote. Trump said last week in response to a journalist question that Bondi had not told him his name was in the files. The administration didn't publicly announce the decision until weeks later, the Journal continues, on July 7th, when the Justice Department posted a memo to its website. The statement, which was unsigned, stated that a thorough review had turned up no list of Epstein's clients, no evidence that would lead to an investigation of uncharged third parties, and no additional documents that merited public disclosure. It said that much of the material would have been sealed in a trial to protect victims and to block the dissemination of child pornography. Your thoughts about how far this reporting goes in filling in some of the blanks?
Well, I mean, I think it's enormously consequential. I think this is a huge stress test for Trump and his coalition, which, you know, it's not all of MAGA, but it is Stewart Rhodes, it is Stephen Bannon, it is Michael Flynn, it is a certain significant portion of his base that is animated by this notion that the deep state and the dismantling of the deep state are job number one for Donald Trump. It's bigger than any tariff war or any social safety net program or even maybe immigration. For them, this is the animating sort of factor in their support for Trump. And it's why Stewart Rhodes said Donald Trump's life was spared during the assassination attempts. He was here to dismantle this elite cabal and open back up our democracy, right? I'm paraphrasing. And they believe so much in that deep state that I think up until this point, maybe even until this article, Nicole, they believe that Trump was shielding the deep state and the elite cabal and not actually maybe just covering his own butt because he was implicated in these Epstein files. And now there is definitive information coming from not the New York Times, not the Washington Post, but Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal, the same man who owns Fox News, that Donald Trump's name is not only in the Epstein files, Donald Trump knew it, and Donald Trump lied to the public about that knowledge. That seems really significant. You say that, and we have this information alongside the Department of Justice reaching out to Ghislaine Maxwell. This would seem to tie their hands greatly in terms of what they can maybe offer her to help them out, because quite obviously it looks now like the president may be trying to hide something to protect himself and his own reputation. And if there is any deal, any pardon, anything with Ghislaine Maxwell, it will be in service to the president's own ends and not that of dismantling the deep state.
Well, it's so interesting, Alex. I mean, you start with Stewart Rhodes. You mentioned Stewart Rhodes, Mike Flynn, and Steve Bannon. They aren't just hardcore Trump. They aren't just hardcore MAGA. They are three recipients of pardons. The only reason they are freely walking the earth is because Donald Trump pardoned those three men. And they are on the other side of Trump and his Justice Department on this story.
Yes, it is an important data point, and it tells you the degree to which, again, this is the banner under which, like, at the expense of their relationship with the president, who they owe their freedom to, this is their cause. The deep state. And Steve Bannon said, look, it's not that he's going to lose. It's not that Trump could lose his entire coalition in the course of this Epstein saga. It's just that he could lose 10 to 15%. And that's enough to lose the House. And that's enough to lose Congress in 2026 and the presidency in 2028. And I think that's real math.
Jonathan, Alex has made this point. We made this point. I mean, it's coming from the Wall Street Journal, I think about 65 hours after the lawsuit wasn't just threatened, but I think filed against the Journal, the journalists. and the parent company and Rupert Murdoch personally. What is the significance of these reporters and this news organization not being intimidated from following the facts wherever they lead?
It's really interesting to me that Donald Trump said openly that he went to Rupert Murdoch to spike the story. Murdoch said he would do it, didn't follow through, or at least indicated to Trump he would do it, which might have been less of a committal response than Murdoch meant to give. Didn't do it, and then Trump held up this fact as if it showed that Murdoch lacks journalistic ethics when really the opposite is the case. In fact, this would actually be a scandal under a normal president, that the president tried to go to a newspaper's owner to spike a damaging story about himself. But I think we should be a little bit cautious about how much the fact that it's the Wall Street Journal and not the Times or the Post is going to carry a weight with Trump's base. Trump has always defined fake news as anything that reports unfavorable facts against him. At times, there have been reporters at Fox News who have broken or confirmed unflattering information for Donald Trump, and he just says they're Trump haters, they're rhinos, it's fake news. And his base will just go along and just say definitionally any facts that Donald Trump doesn't like is fake news, regardless of the source.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Attorney General Pam Bondi privately told Donald Trump that he appeared in the Epstein files multiple times. And she told him this before her Department of Justice declared the Jeffrey Epstein case essentially closed. Nothing to see here, and declined to release any more files to the public, despite all kinds of promises to the contrary. Now, that's the top line of an incredible new piece of reporting from the Wall Street Journal today, detailing that meeting back in May between Trump, his attorney general, and her deputy, former Trump defense lawyer Todd Blanche. We'll have more about him in a moment. According to senior administration officials, Bondi and Blanche told the president at the meeting that the files contained what officials felt was, listen to this, unverified hearsay about many people, including Trump, who had socialized with Epstein in the past. One official familiar with the documents said they contained hundreds of other names. They also told Trump that senior Justice Department officials didn't plan to release any more documents related to the investigation of the convicted sex offender because the material contained child pornography and victims' personal information, the officials said. Now, I should be clear here, NBC News has not independently verified this reporting, which appeared just hours ago in the Wall Street Journal. And let's be clear, the mere presence of a person's name in these files is not an indication of wrongdoing by itself. As we know, Epstein had tons of people that he was associated with. The White House communications director called the Journal report, quote, another fake news story. But we do know that meeting happened. Bondi briefed Trump on the results of her DOJ Epstein investigation in May. And if the Journal's reporting is accurate, and subsequently the Times is reporting along similar lines, if Bondi did tell Trump at that meeting that his name was in the files, then why did he say the opposite when asked about that very thing last week?
Specifically, did she tell you at all that your name appeared in the file?
No, she's given us just a very quick briefing, and in terms of the credibility of the different things that they've seen. And I would say that, you know, these files were made up by Comey, they were made up by Obama, they were made up by the Biden, we went through years of that with the Russia hoax, with all of the different things that we had to go through. We've gone through years of it.
They were made by Barack Obama using his time traveling machine. He was asked directly if Bondi told him he was in the files, and he said no. And then he said the files were made up by a whole bunch of Democrats and rambled about Russia. And now we have a report suggesting that was a lie. I think he would remember if Pam Bondi told him he was in the files, don't you? For what reason would he lie like that? In fact, here's a litany of other things Trump has said about the Epstein case in recent weeks after he was reportedly told his name was in the files.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years.
He's dead for a long time. He was never a big factor in terms of life. I don't understand what the interest or what the fascination is.
It's all been a big hoax. It's perpetrated by the Democrats, and some stupid Republicans and foolish Republicans fall into the net, and so they try and do the Democrats' work. I call it the Epstein hoax.
Remember, he was never a big factor in terms of life. The Journal report raises a lot of other questions. For instance, it says that FBI Director Kash Patel has privately told other government officials that Trump's name appeared in the files, according to people close to the administration. Patel declined to answer the Journal's questions. Now, who exactly would Kash Patel have been telling this to? It's not clear. If he did do that, that seems like kind of a big no-no. It is worth noting that in the middle of all this, back in June, remember when billionaire Elon Musk had his big falling out with Trump over the bill that Trump was pushing? Do you remember when Musk tweeted, then deleted a post saying the following, "Time to drop the really big bomb. Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That is the real reason they have not been made public. Have a nice day, Donald J. Trump." Today's Journal report also cited a statement from Bondi and her deputy, Blanche, saying nothing in the Epstein files warranted further investigation or prosecution. As part of our routine briefing, we made the president aware of the findings they said. But here's the thing. If nothing warranted further investigation, then why is the Trump DOJ suddenly in talks with Epstein's key accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell? Maxwell's currently serving 20 years in federal prison for recruiting and grooming middle school and high school girls for sexual abuse by Epstein and others. And her lawyers in discussion with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who again was Trump's personal defense lawyer in his criminal conviction. Those talks have raised speculation they might be trying to negotiate a deal with Maxwell that could get her out of jail sooner. All of this comes after the Journal's bombshell report late last week describing a letter that Trump reportedly wrote the late child sex trafficker for his 50th birthday. A letter written inside a line drawing of a naked woman with Donald Trump signed where her pubic hair would be, in which he says, among other things, "We have certain things in common, Jeffrey. Enigmas never age. May every day be another wonderful secret." Trump says the story is fake and is suing the reporters, the paper, the owner, Rupert Murdoch, for literally billions of dollars. But if that story rocked Trump world, and it seemed to do that, today's Journal reporting might rock MAGA to its core. It also, crucially, seems to corroborate allegations by ranking Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Dick Durbin. Remember, we reported this just a few days ago, who wrote a letter to Pam Bondi last week demanding her answers to reports that the hundreds of FBI personnel who reviewed the Epstein files were instructed to flag any records in which President Trump was mentioned. All of us leaves us with the question, where is the Attorney General in all this? The Trump appointee who months ago promised to release the Epstein files that were, quote, sitting on her desk, who just 2 weeks ago told us there was nothing worth releasing, who we have learned today reportedly told Trump he was in the Epstein files multiple times. Believe it or not, Pam Bondi was scheduled to speak today at a conservative international summit against human trafficking. But when she was set to take the stage, a Justice Department deputy came out instead.
I do have a note from the Attorney General, from Attorney General Pam Bondi, that I wanted to share, which is the following. I'm sorry to miss all of my CPAC friends today, especially Matt and Mercy Schlapp, Senator Blackburn, and the wonderful team at the Tim Tebow Foundation. Unfortunately, I am recovering from a recently torn cornea, which is preventing me from being with you. I truly wish I was able to join you and support all of the work being done on this critical issue.
Well, when Pam Bondi gets back to work, and we of course wish her well, she'll have a lot of questions to answer. Claire McCaskill is a former Democratic senator of Missouri. Harry Littman serves as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice, and they join me now. Harry, let me start with you as someone who was fairly high up in the Department of Justice. You've served as both a U.S. attorney and in Maine Justice. I have my own feelings about this, but I'm going to ask you and reserve my judgment. Does this seem like a normal process in which the Attorney General goes through a bunch of files, promises some big explosive, disclosure, has agents working literally around the clock to flag appearances of the president's name, then tells the president he's in there, and then says we're not going to release anything?
Bizarre, abnormal, and completely forbidden, Chris, under the rules as they were. Now, we know the Trump team has laid waste to them, but it's 100% clear. Either there's a pending civil and criminal investigation, in which case you may not get within a mile of telling the president his name is mentioned, or there isn't, raising the question, what the hell is the Deputy Attorney General doing in this sort of freelance political operation to talk to Ghislaine Maxwell? What law is he trying to execute and enforce? You may not tell. There are instances. Recall Comey telling Trump as he was coming in, he's in the Russia papers, but that's because of a specific exception. If there's a pending criminal civil investigation, you may not let them know at all. And I really don't know what Blanche now even purports to be doing. What is the mission? It just seems like some freelance political operation that does not fit in the Deputy Attorney General's job description.
One aspect of this, Claire, that I think has made this distinct from other things that happened with Trump is, and I think you'll agree with me, you were a Democratic senator. Look, when there's a Democratic president, the Democratic Party, Democrats, and media, broadly in line with the sort of center-left viewpoint, will criticize that president relentlessly. People on the left will get mad at them very quickly. The Trump experience has been very different insofar as there has been this kind of just full lockstep, right? There's no anger is brooked, a little stuff around Iran, no dissent is tolerated, and this seems like there is something just happening here for the first time where he's taking incoming from his own folks, including a vote with Republicans today to subpoena these files. What do you think?
Well, I keep in mind that Todd Blanche represented him in matters having to do with him paying off a porn star. This is a man who showed his immorality most of his adult life. A serial adulterer. He changed wives as often as he changed shirts, obviously for younger women. He was fooling around with a porn star weeks after his wife gave birth to their only child. And this is the guy that this really rib-rocked Christian Mike Johnson is twisting himself into a pretzel to try to defend. And the bottom line is this, Chris, it is believable that Donald Trump is in these files. It is believable to everyone. They were willing to overlook all the things that he did, and they know he did, for a lot of complicated reasons. But pedophiles and blowing up the conspiracy that they hold near and dear to the foundations of MAGA, protecting all these big, important people that are in these files. And, verified hearsay, I got to tell you the truth. If you've ever read an investigative file, that's what it is. They're called allegations. They're called information. Mm-hmm. They're unverified because they're part of gathering facts. That doesn't mean that they're not reliable or interesting. And this is a bed that Trump made, and now he's got a lie in it. He made his base absolutely believe that this was a file that should be released and that he would release it.
Bradley Edwards is a Florida attorney who has represented over 200 victims of Jeffrey Epstein. He is the author of the book published in 2020, Relentless Pursuit: My Fight for the Victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And joining us now is Bradley Edwards. Mr. Edwards, first of all, I'd like your guidance on our coverage of this story with your clients in mind, with their ongoing suffering in mind, and the sensitivity of their feelings, and how, obviously, this involves the President of the United States. This coverage is going to continue. It's going to continue well into September, we now know, at least. Is there a way for us to handle this that is mindful of what your clients have already suffered?
There is a way. It's not the way that it has been handled thus far. And I think that's the problem. And that's why I agreed to come on the show, because I think that back in 2008, when I sued the government over Jeffrey Epstein's illegal non-prosecution agreement that Alex Acosta gave him, it was because the victims were an afterthought. And now it seems like the victims are not a thought at all. Somehow we've gone backwards, which is not okay. It's irresponsible of everyone. And I think that people really need to remember that real people were hurt here. And every single time that the over-politicizing of this issue comes up, they're hurt all over again. I've been contacted by dozens of clients in the last week, probably over 50, that are paranoid, have extreme anxiety and fear over the way in which this issue has been handled, the politicizing of it. And, give it a prime example. The call for the release of grand jury materials. First of all, everybody knows the grand jury materials is basically worthless. It's nothing. That's what you present to the grand jury before an arrest, before an indictment, before the raids, and before the accumulation of evidence. It's a red herring. But it causes the victims to go, wait, where's our voice? We didn't know about this. Luckily, the judicial system works, and the judges immediately said, wait, we're denying your request. Why? You haven't asked for the victims' opinions. So that at least the judges see the victims are being left out. I can tell you, despite that order from the judges, we still haven't been contacted. Our clients still haven't been asked about their opinions of the release of materials. Put the grand jury materials aside, the victims generally, and as you said, I've represented over 200 of them. Not every one of them is the same. But for the most part, all of them want to heal, and they deserve to heal. And the only way they're going to heal now is if full transparency happens. Release the files, release everything in it except the victims' names. Protect the victims, protect their privacy, release everything else. There's no other reason to hold anything back than if somebody is trying to hold something where there's a cover-up. There's been enough of that. Release it and release it fast. There's a solution to every single problem that has come up, and a quick solution. It doesn't seem like people want it. It seems like it's being driven by salivating over scandal as opposed to dissemination of the truth. One of the things being the birthday book. I have numerous clients who know of the authenticity and the existence of the birthday book. Of course, it was a birthday book that was given to Jeffrey Epstein on his 50th birthday by Ghislaine Maxwell. Jeffrey Epstein's dead. He has an estate. Everybody who knows anything about the story knows knows the estate exists, and it's being governed by the two executors, Darren Indyke, Jeffrey Epstein's former attorney, Richard Kahn, Jeffrey Epstein's former accountant. Those are the two executors. If somebody simply called them on the phone and said, give us the book, they would probably give you the book. They have attorneys. Their attorneys are good. Their attorneys are good people. If they didn't just voluntarily turn over the book out of fear of reprisal, Congress could issue a subpoena to their attorneys at Patterson or at Troutman. Those are the two law firms. I know those attorneys. They would turn the book over immediately. Nobody would have to guess. There wouldn't need to be a lawsuit. There wouldn't have to wait to be discovery. You would immediately have the answers. You could flip to the page. Is there a letter? Is there not a letter? It's over. The victims then get to move on. But that's not what's happening. And that's why I agreed to come on, because so many of them have called and said, somebody needs to remind them. Real people are being hurt here. The truth matters. Transparency actually matters. Get this over with and get it behind us.
I want to go to that book because with your familiarity with evidence against Jeffrey Epstein, which you've collected a lot of through the discovery process, what do you know specifically about that book? Do you know that the estate, the relatives of Jeffrey Epstein, in effect through their lawyers, are in possession of that birthday book?
Yes, I know that the executors of the estate are in possession of that book. And I think that after they turn it over, it should probably be set in the Smithsonian as an artifact at this point in time. It's going to go down in history so that the world can see this book, and they'll know who were Jeffrey Epstein's best friends at the time, what letters did his family write to him, what other pictures are in there, things of that nature. Redact victim names, release the book, and move on. So that's it. Yes, the executors have it.
So you've just identified, not just for the news media, but obviously for House representatives who are now in a mood to subpoena, and also Todd Blanche and the Trump Justice Department, who suddenly are getting curious about investigating this. You've now told them exactly, according to your knowledge, where the birthday book is, who is in possession of that book. And all the House representatives would have to do tomorrow is write up a subpoena for that book, and you believe that it would be the lawyers involved would comply with that subpoena?
I know the executors' lawyers. I've worked with them for years. They're good people. They're good lawyers. They would comply with the subpoena immediately. That it's something that we could solve this problem so quickly if people actually want to solve problems. This idea, yeah, go ahead.
One more thing, Bradley. You said, I think you said that some of your clients have specific knowledge of that birthday book.
Sure. Yes, more than one, multiple of them.
And what is that knowledge? They saw it, or they were around him when he was 50 years old? Were they present at his birthday, his 50th birthday?
I don't know the answer to that last question. I do know that they were involved in the assembly of the book, several of them. They were told by Ghislaine to assist in putting the book together. Others have seen the book post birthday and after it was assembled. So the existence of the book is it's an absolute fact. Now, who wrote letters, what's in the book? You're going to have to get the book to figure it out. But this isn't something that needs to be a mystery forever and drag the victims into all kinds of anxiety for nothing. We can get that answer pretty quickly.
I knew you were going to tell us information about the whereabouts of the book. That I knew before we came on tonight. What I did not think of in all the reporting that's been done about this book and what you just said, which now seems obvious when you say it, is that some of Jeffrey Epstein's victims were actually used by Ghislaine Maxwell to assemble that birthday book, to actually put those letters together in that book.
Yeah, you have to remember that Jeffrey Epstein was abusing and exploiting young women and children every day of his life. So anybody that's around for any major event, such as the assembly of his 50th birthday book, they're going to have to be involved in assembling or playing their part, whatever they were directed to do, with respect to that book. So yes, more than one was involved.
And just to that last point you said, every day of his life, the evidence that you acquired through the discovery process in representing your clients indicates to you that Jeffrey Epstein was committing this kind of rape with girls from middle school and high school, as you just put it, every day of his life.
Well, I would just, the only caveat being young children and young women, probably all under the age of 25. But yes, you're right, as young as 14. And I think that we've represented 50 that were under the age of 18. But it wasn't only minors, just that caveat. I think that the one thing that has really alarmed our clients, particularly today, is the information that now Ghislaine Maxwell is being visited in jail, and that she is somehow being given some credibility and a platform on this particular topic. I think what people are forgetting is that Ghislaine Maxwell wasn't only indicted on sex trafficking charges. Ghislaine Maxwell, because of testimony she gave on multiple occasions in the civil cases where we sued her, she provided testimony, and as a consequence of false testimony, she was indicted on 2 perjury counts on this particular topic. So we're going to go and ask somebody to tell the truth who was indicted on perjury charges related to this particular topic. Now, does she have information that could potentially help? Yes. Will she be truthful about it? Who knows? But whoever is going to be the questioner, whoever's going to be the interrogator, must know more than just a rudimentary understanding of the case. You have to have seen her other deposition transcripts to know what she said so that you can keep her in line. You have to know her testimony from her criminal trial to keep her in line, and you have to understand the case. Sending somebody there that knows nothing, she's going to say whatever she wants to say. And what's her incentive? Is her incentive because she's going to get a deal? I have many clients who say, look, President Trump and Ghislaine Maxwell were good friends back then. Is he going to commute her? Is he going to pardon her? And I have said to them, look, I know that you feel like an afterthought right now. I know that you feel like you don't matter. For him to do that would be he thought about you and he decided you do not matter. I don't think that is on the table. I don't think that he would ever do that. Maybe I'm putting too much trust in him. Maybe I am. But either way, if he's not going to do that, what incentive does she have to tell him anything if she's getting nothing out of it? So there's a big problem here with the process, and it's just another piece of the scandal that is causing enormous anxiety. Let's all remember there were 5 victims at the heart of the sex trafficking trial against Ghislaine Maxwell. 2 are no longer with us. They're dead. We're losing clients because of the anxiety and the suffering of them and their families. And they should be the first thought that every single American has when they think about this case. They shouldn't be an afterthought, and they shouldn't be forgotten. And that's how it feels to them and to me.
And just for the audience, the 2 that you mentioned, both clients of yours, one took her own life a few months ago, and another died of apparent drug overdose last year. Attorney Bradley Edwards, thank you very much for your invaluable perspective on this tonight and what you've revealed to us about your knowledge about that birthday book and how it can be obtained. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Lawrence. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to bring in Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and MSNBC political analyst. Chuck Rosenberg is former U.S. attorney, former senior FBI official, and an MSNBC legal analyst. With me here in studio, former Washington Post national columnist Philip Bump, and Michael Hardaway is former communications director and spokesman for House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Okay, let's start with the law, Chuck. Gabbard says the information she's put out amounts to, and these are her words, new evidence of the most egregious weaponization and politicization of intelligence in American history. Is that what you see?
Well, good for her, Chris. I mean, waving a document in front of a television camera doesn't make it authentic or valid or truthful or accurate. And this may sound incredibly quaint, but if you actually want to charge someone with a crime, try them and convict them, you need this pesky little thing called evidence. And evidence under the federal rules would have to be reliable, relevant, and admissible. So my way of thinking, a House committee report, whether authored by Democrats or Republicans, don't meet any of those standards, and I would discount it entirely.
So, Philip, this is something the president has been promising for years, that pesky thing called evidence. And I want to play some of what we've heard over the years. Take a listen.
The concept of Russia with respect to us is a total phony story.
Meaning the Trump campaign.
Of course it's a total phony story. We have to find out what happened. I'd love to find out what happened.
But you don't think it's
I can tell you one thing. It had nothing to do with us.
Looks like a very serious event, but we'll find out. When they look at the documents, I think people are going to see a lot of bad things happen.
There's tremendous evidence right now as to how unfairly treated I was. President Obama and Biden spied on my campaign. It's never happened in history. They are trying to steal the election, just like they did it last time with spying, and we caught them, and that included President Obama.
Again, none of the investigations ever showed anything that would support anything he just said there. So why, after all these years, after all these investigations, are we back at the same point with the president promising something that he has never been able to deliver?
I would say there's 3 reasons. The first is that his base has been inculcated in this idea that Barack Obama is just the worst political actor there's ever been, stoked by Donald Trump, and are eager to see vengeance enacted upon Obama and his allies. The second reason is that Trump himself feels very slighted by this. He's been angry about this for a long time. You know, the 2016 election, he got mad about Russia. 2020 election, he got mad about the fact that he lost. He, as president now, he's trying to use his power to try and get back at everyone who he thinks caused those things. But the third reason is Jeffrey Epstein, right? The reason this is happening now is always going to happen. Like, let's be clear. You saw it right there. He's very mad about this, so this is going to happen. The reason it's happening now is because he wants people not to pay attention to Jeffrey Epstein. He said so explicitly, both yesterday at the White House and speaking to legislators.
Peter, you've covered both President Trump and President Obama. As the statement from the Obama office noted, they typically don't respond to what they call constant nonsense coming from the White House, but they did this time. Why this? Why this time?
Well, I think the attack on Obama is so over the top. You know, his not only using words like treason, not only, you know, suggesting there was a crime there, but even posting this video, this AI video showing Obama being forced to his knees and handcuffed in the Oval Office and taken off to prison. We've never seen any president do this kind of thing. And it's just, I think for Obama, either A, it's personally offensive in the way he finally says, I'm going to say something, or B, he wanted to make sure that nobody in the public can confused this this level of spin being put out as anything being truthful. So he wanted to make sure the record didn't stand uncontested. Again, and to Philip's point, I mean, go after Obama in part because Obama still remains, according to polls, the most popular politician in the country. Trump is still jealous of Obama. He still has tried to match up to Obama's stature in the country, never has been able to, never come anywhere near Obama's popularity in polls, never come anywhere near Obama in terms of, success in the, in the popular vote. And he wants to tear him down, and he wants to find enemies. He loves an enemy, and he wants to find, another enemy. And right now, the Democrats don't have a leader. And so going after Obama is one way of going after the Democrats.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing. When historians are asked about best and worst presidents, Donald Trump has never come anywhere near Barack Obama. Michael, the Democratic California Congressman Pete Aguilar told NBC News, reflecting what we just heard, quote, "They'll release anything if it buys them another day or two not to talk about Epstein or get the angry mob to talk about Epstein." But if Democrats respond to it, as Pete and many others have, if the former president of the United States responds to it, does it just give it more oxygen and provide more of a distraction?
Yes, but there's a way to do this properly. What Democrats should do is they can respond to it and then pivot to the fact that Donald Trump is overseeing a horrific economy, skyrocketing prices, 17 million people about to lose health care. Every other cost is rising, and Donald Trump is talking about the former president, whom he's been jealous of for at least 10 years, when, if you remember, Barack Obama roasted him during the dinner, and he's been jealous of him since. The truth is that Barack is smarter, he's cooler, he's better looking, and he's much more beloved than Donald Trump, and that really makes him jealous.
Well, Philip, even if the president wants to distract from Jeffrey Epstein, does it cause even more problems just to go after Obama? And according to Axios, quote, "MAGA's expectations are stratospheric. Failure to land anyone behind bars could be seen as a betrayal, a break from the promises made, promises kept mantra that has defined Trump's relationship with his base." So his base is already, frankly, really ticked off about the whole Epstein thing. So how does shifting to Obama help that? It's not like he's going to get a conviction and land him behind bars. What does he get out of it besides maybe one news cycle?
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the personal satisfaction, which we've been talking about. But, I mean, it really does play into this idea that he has presented to his base that he is one of them fighting against the elites. And the challenge of the Epstein thing for him is it's hard for him to dissociate himself from the elite side of that because he's friends with Epstein, because he's in power to release whatever he has. On this, though, he can come back to the side where he feels comfortable, where his base wants him, which is we're punching at all of the enemies of real Americans, and that includes Barack Obama and so on and so forth. So, yes, this is not going to end up with Barack Obama probably facing trial, for God's sake. I mean, who knows what happens with the Justice Department, and we're in really toxic territory. I think it's important to note that as well. Nothing's going to happen legally for Barack Obama here, but Donald Trump is going to just say that, well, it's because of someone else. It's someone else's fault, as he always does, as he's done for each of the 4 investigations that you pointed out. Like his special counsel he appointed found nothing, and they all just move past it because it's always someone else's fault. It's not Trump's fault, and I think that's the play here.
So, Chuck, this criminal referral that Tulsi Gabbard has made to the Justice Department, is it more of a political exercise than a legal one?
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't really carry any legal weight. It doesn't bind the Department of Justice to do anything. Frankly, Chris, when you walk out of the studio this afternoon, you can make a criminal referral on me if you so choose, and it would have about as much meaning as the one that Tulsi Gabbard made. The Department of Justice, when acting normally, to Philip's point, and I've worked under Republican and Democratic presidents and Republican and Democratic attorneys general, would look at the referral, but they would make their own independent assessment, their own independent judgment of the evidence. Again, there is that pesky word. In order to charge somebody, you need a reasonable probability of conviction. In order to have a reasonable probability of conviction, you need valid and admissible evidence. And so referrals don't really mean anything, and I wouldn't give it all that much sustenance.
Michael, we heard Trump heap praise on Gabbard for her work last night, but only after those previous reports, frankly, that questioned her future in the administration. Listen to this.
Director of National Intelligence. Oh, where's Tulsi? She's like hotter than everybody. She's the hottest one in the room right now because she found out with certainty, I think we knew it before, in all fairness, Tulsi. But now you have certainty. She has all the documents. She has everything that you need. And she found out that Barack Hussein Obama led a group of people and they cheated in the elections, and they cheated without question.
But if it doesn't result in anything, and if the MAGA base gets mad again, is she just trading short-term praise for long-term problems? Because it will not be Donald Trump's fault if it doesn't come to fruition. That's for sure.
This is like that movie Idiocracy. Like, they're all just bending the knee to this guy and pretending like he knows what he's talking about. I think that this is only temporary. He'll be mad at her again this time next week, and then she'll have to lie again to make him feel better. This is no way to operate for any government, much less the U.S. government, much less the person in charge of national intelligence in this country.
Well, talking about the way to operate, Peter, this is another example of the federal government using time and taxpayer money and manpower to investigate things that have already been investigated. Is there not real stuff to focus on?
Yeah, lots of stuff to focus on, of course. But you're right. I mean, look, this has been an obsession of his for a long time. And if there had been any there, presumably they would have found it in the 4 years they had after Obama left office. And they didn't. There were critiques of how the investigation was handled in terms of using the Steele dossier in some warrants for the FISA court and so forth. Those were addressed and certainly of concern to a lot of people. But the broader conspiracy that Trump is alleging here has never had any foundation. Remember, Trump has been predicating his political career since the beginning on spreading lies about Barack Obama. This is not new. He started on the national stage, in a way, by saying that Barack Obama was not born in the United States when he knew that wasn't true. He said he sent investigators to Hawaii to find it out, which he never did. And only eventually in 2016 did he finally admit that, yes, Obama was, in fact, born in the United States. So he is willing to say and do all kinds of things. And the only person who actually tried to overturn an election in recent years, who was president of the United States, is, of course, Donald Trump in 2020, when he repeatedly pressured his own vice president, his own Justice Department, Republican governors and state legislators to overturn the certified election results that had gone against him. Nobody else has ever been, has done that. But what he's trying to do here is by clouding the water, saying, well, they tried to cheat, therefore people don't assume that he tried to cheat, or they can take their pick and say, well, our cheaters are better than their cheaters or whatever. But in fact, only one president in recent history has tried to overturn an election, no matter what he says.
Steve, good morning. We'll talk big picture about the tariffs, but let's put on your car czar hat and the Obama administration first. Clearly, something has to give. If you have a 25% tariff, you're an American auto manufacturer. We saw that some of the companies saying they'll lose between $2.5 and $5 billion. But when do consumers start to feel this?
You know, the irony of this, of course, is that a good part of why Trump was in favor of tariffs, his legitimacy for tariffs, was to help the auto industry and to bring car manufacturing back here. And I suspect some viewers, anyway, scratched their heads during this process when the auto companies kept saying, you know, we don't want these tariffs. We don't want these tariffs. Why do they not want these tariffs? Because they actually import a lot of their cars, GM and Chrysler, from Mexico and from other places where manufacturing is less expensive. So now you have the tariffs. And what is happening so far is the companies are absorbing most of it. So contrary to what Trump says, that the Mexicans are going to pay the tariffs or the Canadians are going to pay the tariffs, right now it's been the car companies that are paying the tariffs. And it's cutting, as your correspondent just said, very substantially into their profits. So that's the irony of all this, that it's actually being paid by the very people that Trump is trying to help.
Which is what they said all along, and now here we are, and it's happening. Let's go back to the Japanese trade deal announced yesterday, 15% tariffs. He says that Japan's going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars to great profit of the United States. Help us sift through what's real in that deal and what's sort of fantasy about it.
Let me, by the way, I didn't answer all your question. In terms of American consumers, the companies are saying that pretty soon they're going to have to start raising prices. They can't keep absorbing it. But back to your other question. So, look, first of all, it's classic Trump sort of negotiating style. You threaten something high. This isn't as high as some of the things he's threatened, but 24%. Then you do a deal at a lower percentage, and everybody says, oh, that's great. He backed off a bit, and we got something more reasonable. But the 500 or 550 billion, I've seen different numbers, of investment in the U.S., I don't understand that at all. Maybe there'll be some investment, but the idea that we, America, are somehow going to get 90% of the profits is a concept in business I have never heard. And so who knows what he's talking about. But the Japanese are certainly happy. The stock market was up 3.5% overnight. Toyota stock was way up overnight. This does help them. And we've been fighting this fight, as you know, because Trump himself was involved in it for 40 years over Japanese car imports. And now it's landed in a place that both sides seem to be able to deal with.
So, Steve, let's take a step back. We didn't get the 90 trade deals in 90 days that the administration promised, but after some delay, we're getting some progress now. Japan, yes. Also, he met with the leader of the Philippines yesterday, announced a deal coming there as well. Recently said there's one from Vietnam, although the Vietnamese government hasn't signed off on apparently all of it. Just give us your big picture take right now of the progress that the administration is or is not making on these deals, and what sort of impact will that have for the consumers here?
It's a little hard to know exactly what progress, because he announces deals, and then like the Vietnamese deal, it turns out there really isn't a complete deal done. Normally, it takes a year or two to negotiate any single trade deal. They can sometimes run hundreds of pages of documents over every little piece of it. He's faced with a self-imposed deadline that it'll be interesting to see how he wriggles around, which is that all these tariffs that have been suspended have to go into effect on August 1st if these rest of these 90 deals aren't made, and they're obviously not going to be made in a week. So we're going to have to see what he does about that. So far, the impact on consumers has been fairly muted, one has to say. The companies have been, all these companies, not just auto companies, have been absorbing a lot of these costs. Most of the tariffs have been suspended now while we go through this process. And so once August 1st hits, if he actually does what he says he's going to do, which, of course, you never know if that's what's going to happen, you could start to see prices go up reasonably meaningfully.
So, Steve, on that point, say there's a ship out there somewhere carrying a bunch of Toyotas from Japan to the United States to Long Beach, California. August 1st rolls around, the 15% tariff down from 25% to 15%. That kicks in. What's that going to cost the American consumer? Because the car companies, as you indicated, they're not going to cover it for very long. What's going to happen to the American consumer in purchasing a car?
You're going to see prices go up. I mean, if you take a very rough rule of thumb about products in general, probably something like half the cost of retail costs of a product is the cost of actually the product coming into our country. The rest is sales and distribution and all the other things that go on. So if there's a 15% tariff, you could imagine prices going up 7.5%. But remember, one of the points of tariffs is that they go up not just on what's being imported, they also go up on domestic goods, the same goods, because once the imported price goes up 7.5% or 15% or whatever it goes up, a domestic manufacturer, and this is really the point of tariffs, or one of the points, domestic manufacturers say, well, I don't need to price my goods at 7.5% less than Toyota, so I'm going to raise my price at 7.5%, and prices go up for everybody who makes that particular good. And this is, what we've been arguing about now for a couple of years. Who's really paying these tariffs? And your correspondent, with all due respect, talked about the countries paying the tariffs, the exporting countries.
We're paying.
They don't pay the tariffs. We're paying the tariffs, whether it's our companies in lower profits or our consumers. This is coming out of the pockets, for the most part, at the end of the day, of Americans.
Which, again, is what people like you and economists across the world warned as these were thrown out there and floated